A single photograph nearly started a war. It showed something that was not supposed to be there. Long weapons, hidden sights, a dangerous plan. And the moment U.S. leaders saw it, the room went silent. Because the picture meant one terrifying thing. Missiles were being placed in Cuba, just a short distance from the United States. Close enough that, if fired, they could reach American cities fast. Washington, D.C., New York, Miami, and more. It was October 1962, and the world suddenly felt like it was standing on the edge of a cliff. President John F. Kennedy was told the news in a private meeting. His face tightened. His advisors stared at the image like it could bite them. One man finally said the words everyone was thinking. If this is real, we could be days away from nuclear war. That is the highest peak of the story. The Cuban Missile Crisis was not just a political argument. It was a countdown. A moment in history when the world held its breath because two superpowers, America and the Soviet Union, were watching each other with fear, pride, and weapons powerful enough to destroy entire cities. And here is the cliffhanger. President Kennedy now had to choose what to do next. If he did nothing, the missiles might become ready. If he attacked, the Soviets might strike back. If he made the wrong move, millions could die. And the scariest part? He had only days to decide. Now let's go back to the beginning, before the photograph, before the secret meetings, before America realized how close danger really was. After World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union became rivals. They were not fighting each other directly, but they were in a long struggle called the Cold War. It wasn't a war with armies marching across borders every day. It was a war of pressure, spying, threats, and fear. Both sides built nuclear weapons. These were not normal bombs. These were weapons so powerful that one could destroy a city. Because of that, both sides tried to keep their weapons ready, so the other side would be too scared to attack first. That fear created a balance. A dangerous balance. Then came Cuba. Cuba is an island nation not far from Florida. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, Cuba's government changed. A new leader, Fidel Castro, came to power. The U.S. government did not like the new direction Cuba was taking, and tensions grew. The Soviet Union saw Cuba as an opportunity. If the Soviets could become close allies with Cuba, they could place power right near the United States. And in 1961, something happened that made Cuba and the Soviet Union even closer, a failed invasion known as the Bay of Pigs. The attempt did not succeed, and it made Castro feel more threatened by America. So Cuba wanted protection. The Soviet leader at the time, Nikita Khrushchev, wanted leverage. He wanted a way to pressure the United States. And he wanted a way to change the balance of power. So the Soviets began secretly sending missiles and military equipment to Cuba. They tried to hide it. They used ships, crates, cover stories, and careful planning. They believed they could do it quietly, without the world noticing. For a while it worked. Then American spy planes began flying over Cuba and taking photos. One day, those photos captured something impossible to ignore. Missile sites. Under construction. Real evidence. When U.S. officials confirmed it, they rushed to the White House with the information. That is when the crisis truly began. President Kennedy gathered a small group of top advisors. They met in secret. They argued, planned, and worried. This was the low part of the story. Quiet rooms, heavy decisions, hard choices. Some advisors wanted an immediate airstrike to destroy the missile sites. Others warned that attacking Cuba could lead to a Soviet attack somewhere else, maybe even in Europe. Some suggested doing nothing and accepting it. But Kennedy knew the American public would not accept Soviet nuclear missiles just 90 miles from Florida. So he looked for another option. He chose a strategy called a naval blockade, though the U.S. called it a quarantine. The idea was to send U.S. Navy ships to stop Soviet ships from bringing more weapons into Cuba. This was serious, because if a Soviet ship refused to stop, the U.S. Navy might have to force it. And if shots were fired, the crisis could become a war. Meanwhile, Kennedy prepared to speak to the nation. The whole country would soon learn what was happening. Parents would listen with fear. Kids would sense the tension. People would look at the sky, and wonder what the future held. And that brings us to the extreme ending of Chapter 1. On national television, President Kennedy announced the truth. Missiles were in Cuba, and the U.S. Navy was moving to stop more weapons from arriving. Across the world, leaders listened. Across the oceans, ships continued toward the blockade line. And everyone understood one thing. The next move could decide the fate of the world. The night after President Kennedy spoke on television, America felt unusually quiet. Families sat in living rooms staring at the screen even after it went dark. Some parents whispered in the kitchen so their kids wouldn't hear. Some people called relatives just to say, "I love you," because they didn't know what the next day would bring. Outside, the streets looked normal. Cars still moved. Stores still opened. But inside people's minds, a giant question kept repeating. Will there be a nuclear war? In Washington, the White House stayed busy late into the night. Kennedy and his advisors watched maps and reports like their lives depended on it because they did. The U.S. Navy was moving into position around Cuba. Ships spread out across the ocean to form the blockade line. Their job was simple to explain but terrifying to live. Stop Soviet ships from bringing more missiles. But that meant something dangerous. If a Soviet ship refused to stop, U.S. forces would have to decide whether to let it pass or confront it. And if U.S. sailors boarded a Soviet ship, the Soviets could see it as an attack. One wrong action, one wrong order, and the world could explode into war. This was the low part of the story, waiting, watching, holding breath. Then came the high, extreme moment. Soviet ships were getting closer. Radar tracked them moving toward the blockade. American commanders watched their positions carefully. People in command rooms spoke in quiet voices, like loud words could cause disaster. Some Soviet ships slowed down.
Some stopped.
Some turned around. That was a relief.
But not all of them.
And even worse, the missiles already in Cuba were still being built and prepared. The U.S. knew time was running out. Meanwhile, Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, was watching too. He didn't want to look weak. He didn't want to back down in front of the world. But he also did not want nuclear war. Both sides were trapped by pride. And pride is dangerous. As the days passed, American spy planes kept flying over Cuba to track the missile sites. Every flight was risky. If a plane was shot down, the U.S. might feel forced to respond with an attack. And then it happened. A U.S. U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba. This was one of the most terrifying moments of the entire crisis. In the White House, advisors went pale. Some said, "We have to respond." Others warned, "If we respond, this could become the first strike of war." Kennedy had to make a decision quickly. This is where the story becomes a tightrope. Kennedy did not want to start a war, but he also couldn't ignore an American plane being destroyed. So he tried to stay calm. He tried to avoid a rush into violence. But pressure was everywhere. Military leaders pushed for an airstrike. Some politicians demanded action. The public was scared. And in Cuba, soldiers continued working at missile sites. The world was shaking like a glass about to fall off a table. Then came another twist. A message arrived from Khrushchev.
It was not a simple message.
It was emotional, almost pleading. Khrushchev suggested a possible deal. The Soviets would remove missiles from Cuba if the U.S. promised not to invade Cuba. This sounded hopeful.
But it wasn't that easy.
Because another message came soon after, with different demands. It mentioned U.S. missiles in Turkey and hinted the Soviets wanted those removed too. Now Kennedy faced a puzzle. Which message was the real offer? Was Khrushchev divided inside his own government? Was the Soviet military pressuring him? Or was it a trick? Kennedy and his advisors argued again. Some wanted to accept the deal quickly. Some warned it could make America look weak. Others said the only goal was to avoid nuclear war, no matter the politics. While leaders argued, time kept moving. And the scariest part of the crisis wasn't only the leaders in offices. It was the soldiers in the field. Because soldiers might act without knowing the whole situation. In the ocean, U.S. ships were facing Soviet submarines. Underwater, Soviet submarine crews were trapped in heat and stress, and they didn't know what was happening above. They didn't have clear communication. They felt threatened. One misunderstanding underwater could have been catastrophic. This is what made the Cuban Missile Crisis so frightening. It wasn't only one decision. It was hundreds of small decisions happening in many places at once. Kennedy decided to respond carefully. He would publicly agree to the main part of the deal, no invasion of Cuba, if the Soviets removed the missiles. Privately, the U.S. also made moves about missiles in Turkey later, but the key goal was to stop the crisis. But before anything could be final, both sides had to take one last step. The Soviets had to choose to back down, and the U.S. had to trust they would. That brings us to the extreme ending of Chapter 2. On the final dangerous day, the world waited for Khrushchev's answer. U.S. forces stayed ready. Soviet forces stayed ready. Cuba stayed on edge. And everyone knew, if the answer was no, the next step could be war. The morning was tense. In Washington, President Kennedy sat quietly as advisors brought in updates. Radios crackled. Phones rang. No one joked. No one relaxed. Every person in the room understood one truth. This day could decide whether the world survived. Across the ocean, Soviet leaders were under pressure too. Nikita Khrushchev knew that if he pushed too far, the United States might attack Cuba. And if the U.S. attacked, the Soviet Union would feel forced to respond somewhere else. That response could lead to nuclear war. And nuclear war had no winners. For days, Khrushchev had argued with his own advisors. Some wanted to stand firm and challenge the U.S. Others warned that continuing meant disaster. Meanwhile, the missiles in Cuba were still there. U.S. planes kept watching them. U.S. ships stayed on alert. Missiles on both sides stayed ready. The world was frozen in fear. Then, finally, a message arrived. It was from Khrushchev. This time, the message was clear. The Soviet Union would remove the missiles from Cuba. In return, the United States would promise not to invade Cuba. When Kennedy read the message, he closed his eyes for a moment. The room stayed silent. Then someone whispered, "It's over." But Kennedy didn't celebrate yet. Because in moments like this, words matter. Actions matter. And mistakes can still happen. U.S. forces stayed in place until they saw proof. Spy planes watched as missile sites were taken apart. Ships tracked Soviet vessels leaving Cuban waters. Slowly, carefully, the danger faded. The blockade ended. The crisis was over. The world had stepped back from the edge. In the days that followed, people began to understand how close they had come to disaster. Later reports revealed just how fragile the situation really was. Some Soviet submarines near the blockade carried nuclear weapons. Their crews were under extreme stress. If one commander had made a different choice, the outcome could have been terrible. This shocked leaders on both sides. Kennedy and Khrushchev realized that the world could not survive many moments like this. So they made changes. A direct phone line was set up between Washington and Moscow, so leaders could talk quickly in future crises. Efforts began to limit nuclear weapons testing. Slowly, cautiously, both sides tried to reduce the risk of accidental war. The Cuban Missile Crisis became a lesson written in fear. It showed how fast misunderstandings could turn into global threats. It showed how pride could be as dangerous as weapons. And it showed how leadership under pressure could save lives or destroy them. For ordinary Americans, the crisis left a deep mark. People remembered where they were when Kennedy spoke. They remembered the fear in their parents' eyes. They remembered wondering if tomorrow would come. Schools practiced drills. Families talked about fallout shelters. The idea of nuclear war became real, not just something from movies or headlines. And Cuba? Cuba remained a symbol of how global power struggles can place small nations at the center of massive danger. The missiles were gone, but the memory stayed. Today, historians still study those 13 days in October 1962. They look at every decision, every message, every pause. Because the Cuban Missile Crisis was not just a moment in history. It was a warning, a reminder that the world once came incredibly close to destroying itself and stepped back only at the last second. And the most important lesson of all is this: peace is fragile. And it must be protected, even when fear is loud.